The shredder in the Mar-a-Lago service wing jammed for exactly 9 seconds, long enough for a single strip of paper to hang, half-chewed, before an aide yanked the power cord from the wall. The strip wasn't a letter. It wasn't a speech draft. It was a color-coded timeline, dates, names, and a column labeled Exposure Window. Someone wrote one word in red ink at the bottom, inevitable. That jam set off a chain reaction. By 02:19 a.m., a secure phone lit up in a bedroom down the hall. By 02:21 a.m., a private attorney who hadn't been seen in Florida in months was already awake in Washington. And by 02:26 a.m., a former president was sitting upright in bed, staring at a ceiling fan, calculating how many hours remained before the next filing hit the docket. This isn't about optics anymore. This is about math. At 02:42 a.m., a clerk in a federal building uploaded a routine scheduling update. No press release, no alert, just a time-stamped entry that quietly collapsed 3 parallel defenses into one timeline. The kind of procedural move that looks harmless until you realize it synchronizes judges, jurisdictions, and sentencing frameworks. When that happens, leverage evaporates, delay dies, and fear changes texture. The mood inside Trump's inner circle shifted instantly. Not panic, something colder. Panic is loud. This was silent triage. At 03:04 a.m., a jet that wasn't supposed to fly until morning requested an unscheduled slot. No destination listed. At 03:11 a.m., a donor who hadn't returned calls in weeks suddenly sent a one-line message, "I can't be on record anymore." At 03:18 a.m., an encrypted group chat went dark. Not muted, deleted. Here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say out loud. Prison isn't decided by verdicts alone. It's decided by path dependency. The point where every remaining option increases exposure rather than reduces it. That point may have already passed. What makes this moment different isn't the charges. It's the convergence. 3 legal tracks that once competed for attention are now reinforcing each other. Evidence in one case unlocks motive in another. Testimony here validates documents there. A strategy that worked in isolation becomes lethal in combination. Defense teams know this pattern. Prosecutors live for it. At 03:37 a.m., a longtime ally floated the word pardon in a private message. No response. Because everyone in that room understood the problem. Pardons don't erase state time, and they don't neutralize sentencing enhancements triggered by prior findings. Once certain boxes are checked, the floor rises. Dramatically. By 03:58 a.m., the conversation turned inward. Not how do we win, but who breaks first? That's the moment fear becomes rational. Because prison isn't always imposed by judges. It's invited by defectors. There's a reason Trump looks different lately. It's not age, it's compression. When timelines collapse, the future presses closer. Speeches shorten. Rants lose rhythm. The improvisational bravado that once filled rooms now circles the same talking points over and over, like a pilot stuck in a holding pattern with dwindling fuel. At 04:21 a.m., a senior advisor used a phrase that hasn't been heard in years. Post-verdict world. Not if, when. This is the front row seat most people never see. The hours where power recalculates its odds, where loyalty is audited, where silence becomes currency. The cameras will show rallies and bravado later today. But behind closed doors, the question isn't whether a fight is coming. It's whether the system has already closed the exits. Because once inevitability stops being rhetoric and starts being arithmetic, even the loudest man in the room has to whisper to himself one final question before dawn. How much time is left, and who's about to trade theirs for mine? 03:12 a.m. marked the transition point from crisis management to structural reality, because this situation wasn't created overnight. It was engineered over decades by 3 power players who never appear on the same stage, never share credit, and never speak the same language. Their influence isn't loud, it's architectural. The first power player is the institutional prosecutor class. Not a person, but a career ecosystem. These are attorneys who rotate between federal offices, appellate benches, and elite firms, carrying institutional memory like a hard drive. Years ago, after watching high-profile cases collapse under spectacle, they redesigned their approach. Less television, more paperwork, fewer grand gestures, more sequencing. The invisible architecture they built favors attrition over confrontation. Charges are stacked not to shock the public, but to exhaust defendants. Every motion triggers another clock. Every appeal opens a new jurisdictional door. The system isn't rigged to win fast. It's rigged so that resistance becomes self-destructive. There's a historical echo here. In the 1970s, prosecutors learned the hard way that frontal assaults create martyrs, so they shifted. They let targets talk. They let allies defect quietly. By the time indictments came, the outcome felt pre-decided, not because of bias, but because the math had already been done. Defiance wasn't crushed with force. It was dissolved through process. The second power player is the compliance bureaucracy. Clerks, administrators, record custodians, and procedural gatekeepers. They don't make headlines, they don't make speeches, but they decide what gets filed, when it gets filed, and how quickly it moves. Years ago, reforms standardized data sharing between jurisdictions under the banner of efficiency. The unintended consequence, or intended, depending on who you ask, was interoperability. A filing in one court now automatically cross-references another. A transcript here flags inconsistencies there. What looks like neutral modernization becomes a web. Once you're inside it, every movement tightens the mesh. This architecture has its own historical echo. In past political collapses, leaders didn't fall because crowds turned on them. They fell because paperwork stopped bending. Forms were filled correctly. Rules were followed to the letter. The institution didn't rebel. It complied. And that compliance, rigid and unfeeling, became the weapon. The psychology of this bureaucracy is critical to understand. It doesn't hate. It doesn't love. It processes. When pressure comes from above, it doesn't resist. It waits. When pressure comes from below, it doesn't react. It documents. Silence isn't fear here. Silence is protocol. The third power player is the earned defection market. Former allies, aides, donors, and intermediaries who understand that proximity to power is only valuable until it becomes liability. Years ago, after watching scandals consume entire networks, legal frameworks were adjusted to incentivize early cooperation, reduced exposure, narrow immunity, sealed testimony. The message was subtle but clear. The first to speak survives best. This created a culture where loyalty is performative until it isn't, where silence is temporary and memory is monetized. Another historical echo surfaces here. In previous institutional reckonings, the collapse didn't start at the top. It started at the edges. Assistants, accountants, advisors who believed they were invisible. When they realized invisibility had an expiration date, they recalculated. Defiance didn't end with a bang. It leaked away, one affidavit at a time. Together, these three players form a closed loop. Prosecutors build timelines. Bureaucracies enforce them. Defectors validate them. No single actor needs to conspire. The system moves because each part is doing exactly what it was designed to do. This is why traditional counterattacks fail. Rallies don't slow filings. Media appearances don't pause deadlines. Outrage doesn't change sentencing guidelines. The institution's psychology is immune to spectacle. It responds only to documentation, precedent, and sequence. Silent compliance is the lubricant. Judges issue narrow rulings. Clerks process without comment. Former allies decline interviews but answer subpoenas. No one announces betrayal. They just stop returning calls. The gears keep turning because no one believes it's their job to stop them. By 04:48 a.m., this reality had settled in, not as despair but as recognition. The crisis isn't driven by enemies. It's driven by a system that was quietly reinforced years ago, layer by layer, to handle exactly this scenario. And once you understand that architecture, one thing becomes clear. This isn't about a single trial or a single verdict. It's about a structure that rewards motion and punishes resistance. A structure where the most dangerous moment isn't indictment day, but the day you realize the institution no longer needs you to cooperate to move forward. That's when defiance stops being heroic and starts being irrelevant. 0809 a.m. The room had no flags, no seals, no windows, just a long table, a legal pad with a torn corner, and a recorder placed face down like it didn't want to be seen. This wasn't an official meeting. It was the kind that happens when official channels are no longer safe. "Let's be precise," the man at the end of the table said, tapping the pad. He was the opportunist. Not ideological, not emotional, a survivor. If this goes to trial on the current sequencing, the exposure isn't symbolic, it's terminal. Across from him sat the ideologue, rigid posture, arms crossed, voice controlled by belief rather than outcome. "You're assuming the base accepts that reality. They won't. We escalate, we pressure, we make it politically radioactive." The opportunist didn't look up. That playbook worked when timelines were negotiable. They're not anymore. He slid a folder forward. No label. Just wait. Inside wasn't a smoking gun. It was worse. A ledger. Handwritten entries cross-referenced with digital timestamps. Dates aligned with travel logs. Payments synced with access points. The kind of document that doesn't need interpretation because it explains itself. The ideologue flipped through it anyway, slower with each page. "This doesn't prove intent," he said finally. "It proves continuity," the opportunist replied, "and continuity triggers enhancements." Silence filled the room. Not dramatic silence, but administrative silence, the kind that follows when everyone understands the rules and realizes they've already been applied. Another voice joined in from the side. A lawyer who hadn't spoken yet. "There's also the recording." The recorder on the table suddenly mattered. Not a wiretap. Not a sting. A voluntary recording made years ago by someone who believed loyalty would protect them. A conversation about strategy, about pressure points, about moving pieces before anyone notices. At the time, it sounded like bravado. Now, it sounded like corroboration. The ideologue leaned back. "We challenge admissibility." "You can," the lawyer said, "but even if it's excluded, it shapes everything else. Witness prep, judicial tone, sentencing posture. It changes the weather." This is how power actually shifts. Not with shouts, but with weather changes. At 0847 a.m., the opportunist checked his phone. 3 missed calls. Same number. A former ally. Someone who used to sit closer to the center than anyone else in that room. The calls stopped abruptly. That told him more than any voicemail could. "They're shopping cooperation," he said. The ideologue snapped upright. "You don't know that." "I do," the opportunist replied, "because that number doesn't call twice unless it's already decided." This was the fracture line. Belief versus calculus. The ideologue stood. If we fold now, it validates everything. The system wins because we let it. The opportunist finally met his eyes. The system wins because it was built to. The only question left is who it lets survive. The ledger stayed on the table. No one moved it, because touching it felt like accepting it. By 0912 a.m., the conversation turned transactional. Not about innocence or justice, but containment. How much damage could be localized? Which narratives could be sacrificed to protect which players? Who could plausibly claim ignorance, and who couldn't anymore? This is the moment most people never see, the pivot from fighting to negotiating terms of loss. One line from a leaked memo summarized it best. "Posture for sentencing, not exoneration." That sentence never reaches the public, but it governs everything that follows. At 0936 a.m., the opportunist made the quietest move of the meeting. He slid a business card across the table, not to the ideologue, but to the lawyer. No names, just a secure channel and a time window. "If this goes the way I think it's going," he said, "that channel matters." The ideologue laughed, sharp, defensive. "You're already planning for a world where he's gone." "No," the opportunist said. "I'm planning for a world where the institution doesn't wait for permission." That's the core truth of this moment. There is no dramatic arrest scene inside these rooms, no shouting matches, just adults who understand incentives adjusting to a system that has stopped blinking. And here's where you come in. Because everything you're hearing, these rooms, these memos, these fractures, never surface in real time. They leak out slowly, filtered, sanitized, unless you know where to look, unless you're part of the circle that tracks power before it collapses publicly. That's why people subscribe, not for outrage, for foresight, to see the moves before they're announced, to understand why yesterday's confidence suddenly sounds rehearsed today. By 10:02 a.m., the meeting ended without resolution. No vote, no handshake, just an understanding that the next move wouldn't be made in that room. It would be made by someone deciding whether to protect themselves or go down with the story they used to believe in. And once that decision is made, everything else becomes inevitable. 14:06 p.m. was when the leak stopped being internal, not because of a press conference or a whistleblower, but because markets, courts, and foreign desks all reacted at once. 3 unrelated headlines appeared within 20 minutes, procedural on their own, devastating in combination, a delayed bond filing, a court denial phrased so narrowly it boxed in every future appeal, and a foreign ministry spokesperson who said nothing at all when asked about stability. Silence calibrated to the millimeter. This is how encirclement becomes visible. The first factor is mathematical inevitability. Numbers don't argue back. Polling volatility, fundraising compression, legal costs accelerating faster than inflows. These curves crossed quietly weeks ago. Analysts saw it before commentators did. When expenses compound and optionality shrinks, the system doesn't need to intervene. It just waits. That's why donors aren't defecting loudly. They're tapering, smaller checks, longer gaps, plausible deniability. Arithmetic does the rest. The second factor is legal encirclement. No dramatic raids, no surprise indictments, just doors closing one at a time. Motions denied without prejudice, meaning not now, not never. Scheduling orders that look neutral but synchronize outcomes. When multiple courts begin referencing each other's findings, a perimeter forms. Defense strategies that once played jurisdictions against each other now echo back as contradictions. The public sees confidence. The docket sees constraint. The third factor is institutional betrayal, but betrayal without villains. Agencies release documents exactly when required. Judges write opinions that cite precedent instead of names. Former allies testify to process rather than intent. No one breaks ranks because there are no ranks left to break. The institution doesn't turn on leaders. It sheds them when they become inefficient. What's remarkable is how opponents are responding. They're not attacking. They're not celebrating. They're practicing political aikido, redirecting force by refusing to meet it. When rallies escalate rhetoric, opponents lower volume. When threats of exposure are teased, opponents release nothing. They let gravity work. Every overreach tightens the loop. Every demand for loyalty highlights who hasn't answered the phone. Internationally, the ripple effect is subtle but unmistakable. Invitations aren't rescinded, they're postponed. Statements aren't contradicted, they're footnoted. Intelligence briefings stop mentioning names and start mentioning continuity. That word travels. It tells allies the system will hold even if personalities don't. It tells adversaries there's no vacuum to exploit. Stability through subtraction. At 15:11 p.m., a major network ran a segment that looked harmless. 2 experts debating timelines. But the chyron betrayed the shift. Sentencing exposure. Not charges, not allegations. Exposure assumes outcome. Language always moves first. Strategic silence does the rest. Opponents understand that the most effective move is to let statements age without response, to let contradictions accumulate, to let the public notice that defenses change weekly while filings don't. This isn't mercy, it's efficiency. By 16:02 p.m., the internal war had fully leaked into the open, not as scandal, but as atmosphere. You can feel it in the pauses, in the careful phrasing, in the way questions are answered around rather than through. Power doesn't vanish in these moments, it redistributes. Encirclement doesn't announce itself, it reveals itself through restraint, through institutions doing less, not more, through a world that stops reacting because it's already adjusted, and once that happens, the final outcome isn't driven by outrage or applause. It's driven by a system that has decided it no longer needs noise to move forward. 17:03 p.m. is where analysis turns into a war game. Not rhetoric, not belief, just branching paths and diminishing margins. Over the next 30 days, there are only 3 viable stages left on the board, and none of them end clean. Stage 1 begins immediately and lasts roughly 10 days. It's the containment push. Public posture hardens. Statements become absolute. Allies are asked, not publicly, but quietly, to reaffirm loyalty. Emergency fundraising accelerates. Legal teams flood the zone with motions, not because they expect wins, but because they need time. Survival probability here sits around 45%. And that number isn't about innocence, it's about delay. This stage survives only if no new evidence surfaces and no insiders flip under seal. The moment either happens, the clock jumps forward. Stage 2 activates if containment fails. This is the R fragmentation phase. Days 11 through 20. Messaging splinters. One camp argues escalation. Pressure the system, challenge legitimacy, mobilize outrage. Another camp argues insulation. Separate the individual from the network, quietly distance institutions, preserve futures. You'll see it in real time. Contradictory talking points, surrogates contradicting each other, legal filings that no longer share a unified theory. Survival probability drops to 25%. Here, because fragmentation creates witnesses, every internal disagreement produces someone with an incentive to document their version first. Stage 3 is the final window, days 21 through 30, the negotiated collapse. No press conference announces it, no headline confirms it, but behavior changes. Language shifts from absolutes to hypotheticals, from never to if, from fight to process. Legal strategy pivots from dismissal to mitigation. Sentencing exposure is modeled, not denied. This stage has a high 10% survival probability, not of victory, but of control. Control over timing, over narrative, over who absorbs the blast radius. Everything outside these stages is noise. Now here's the part no one wants to hear. None of these stages are mutually exclusive. They can overlap, they can fail early. And once a single defector enters the record with corroboration, ledger, recording, or contemporaneous notes, the entire game board tilts. Not dramatically, permanently. So what's the ultimatum? The next 48 hours matter more than the next 48 days. Watch for 3 signals. First, a sealed filing unsealed without commentary. No quotes, no leaks. Just a document appearing where one wasn't before. That's procedural truth surfacing. Second, a surrogate who suddenly stops defending and starts contextualizing. Listen for phrases like regardless of outcome or faith in the system. That's insulation language. Third, institutional silence from a place that used to amplify. No retweets, no statements, no pushback. Silence isn't absence, it's alignment. If you see 2 of those 3 within 48 hours, Stage 2 has already begun. If all 3 appear, Stage 3 is underway whether anyone admits it or not. This is why moments like this feel uncanny. The rallies still happen, the speeches still thunder, but underneath, the system has already moved on to endgame logistics, not because it hates anyone, but because it doesn't need them anymore. And that's the most dangerous realization of all. Power doesn't fall when it's defeated. It falls when it becomes unnecessary.